Saturday morning, September 8th, 1900. Galveston, Texas. The beach is already busy by 8 o'clock. Families on the shore. The Gulf water warm. The sky overcast but ordinary. Two details are wrong. The tide is higher than the tables predicted, and the waves are arriving from two directions at once. Long, powerful swells crossing from the southeast, the kind generated hundreds of miles offshore. The chief meteorologist drives his cart along the beach, telling people to leave. Most stay to watch. 5 days earlier, the Cuban Meteorological Service had correctly forecast the storm's path and transmitted a warning to Washington. The Weather Bureau dismissed it. No evacuation was ordered. Between 8,000 and 12,000 people died on that island before sunrise. More Americans in a single event than at Antietam, more than Pearl Harbor, more than September 11th. The deadliest natural disaster in United States history started as a Saturday with slightly odd waves. Galveston in 1900 was one of the wealthiest cities in the American South. Its port handled more cotton exports than any other in the region. The city had electric lights, telephones, trolley cars, and grand Victorian mansions lining Broadway that residents called castles. Not exaggeration, but as description of how they perceived their own permanence. The wealth was not evenly distributed, but its markers were visible everywhere. In the opera house, in the private clubs, in the scale and confidence of civic planning. The entire city sat on a barrier island 30 miles long and less than 3 miles wide. The highest natural point on the island measured 7 feet above sea level, lower than a residential ceiling. Barrier islands are geological crumple zones. They absorb oceanic energy that would otherwise reach the mainland. They shift, erode, and rebuild on timescales of decades. They are not meant to be permanent. Galveston had built a permanent city on a landscape whose function was to be periodically destroyed and reformed. The island's position amplified every meteorological threat. The Gulf of Mexico is a semi-enclosed basin. Hurricanes tracking north-northwest across it push water ahead of them, with no open ocean to absorb the surge. The Texas coast curves gently westward, creating a shallow concave shoreline that concentrates storm-driven water rather than dispersing it. Galveston Bay, behind the island, provides no buffer. It is a body of water that can rise from both directions simultaneously when a storm stalls or wobbles in approach. The island had been chosen as a port site because the bay made it viable, not because it was safe. No one in 1838, when Galveston was founded, had thought to ask whether the mathematics of Gulf surge would eventually exceed the island's maximum elevation. The last major hurricane had struck in 1875, when the city was a fraction of its 1900 size. No one living in 1900 had experienced catastrophic loss. The 25 years without disaster had become proof of immunity rather than luck. The grand buildings reinforced this logic. If we can build this, we can withstand anything. The grander the architecture, the more unthinkable its destruction. The city's prosperity was read as evidence that it had earned permanence, that the Gulf would not reach it because it had proven itself too significant to lose. Isaac Klein's 1891 paper completed the architecture of false confidence. A geological guarantee from a credentialed scientist, published and cited, told civic leaders and investors what they wanted to hear. The mathematics of the Gulf floor made a catastrophic hurricane here impossible. The paper had no particular influence on individual decisions. No one framed their house differently because of it. But it shaped institutional behavior. No seawall was built, no evacuation plan was made, no emergency protocol existed. The city was safe. The paper said so. The Weather Bureau in 1900 had no radar, no satellite imagery, and no aircraft reconnaissance. Tracking hurricanes required assembling telegraph reports from ships at sea and coastal stations into a fragmentary picture of where a storm had already been. Forecasting its path required extrapolation. The system worked adequately for slow-moving storms with predictable tracks. It was nearly blind to rapid intensification and last-minute course changes. Cuba's meteorological service operated a different network. Jesuit priests had built a system of observation stations across the Caribbean, starting in the 1870s, developing methods for tracking and predicting tropical cyclone behavior. By 1900, Cuban forecasters had tracked hundreds of storms across the basin and had a demonstrated record of accurate prediction. On September 4th, Father Lorenzo Ganguat, director of Havana's Belen Observatory, issued warnings that a major hurricane was heading toward the Texas Gulf Coast. The United States Weather Bureau's chief, Willis Moore, had instituted a policy centralizing all hurricane forecasts through Washington. Cuban warnings were not to be relayed without his approval. Moore's stated rationale was consistency and accuracy. The actual effect was that more timely, better-sourced regional data was filtered through an office operating at a greater distance from the storm. Moore had also been in active institutional conflict with Cuban forecasters, having worked to suppress their independent influence in the Caribbean. Gangwait's September 4th warning was received in Washington, assessed as overcautious by forecasters working with less observational data, and not transmitted to Galveston. The better forecast was not withheld deliberately to cause harm. It was withheld because institutional rivalry had made the source untrustworthy in the eyes of the people holding the relay switch. The Bureau's forecast, issued through normal channels, acknowledged a tropical disturbance in the Gulf, but issued no evacuation guidance. By September 7th, the storm was northwest of Cuba and accelerating. By September 8th, Klein's barometer was falling sharply. He flagged the warnings from Washington, raised the storm flags on the Weather Bureau building, a black square with a red center, the designated signal for extreme danger, and drove his cart to the beach to warn people directly. He had the training to read what was happening. He had also published an article telling everyone it could not happen. He could not reverse a decade of institutional assurance in a few hours on a Saturday morning, and the physical reality of a barrier island with 3 bridges and no organized evacuation infrastructure meant that even earlier, communication might not have saved the entire city. What it might have saved was some portion of the 8,000 to 12,000 who had no warning at all until the water was at their doors. September 8, 1900. Galveston residents woke to water behaving incorrectly. The Gulf tide was higher than the tide tables predicted. The bayside was also rising, water pushing from 2 directions simultaneously. The swells arriving on the beach were long, rhythmic, and powerful. Storm waves generated hundreds of miles offshore, the leading edge of something massive. By late morning, water covered the lower sections of the city. This was not rainfall overflow. It was storm surge arriving ahead of the hurricane. The atmospheric pressure at the storm center was low enough that the ocean surface directly beneath it bulged upward. As the hurricane tracked northwest, it pushed this dome of elevated water ahead of itself. The shallow Gulf floor did not dissipate the surge. It piled water against the coastline with nowhere to drain. Some residents went to the beach to observe the waves. Galveston had weathered storms before, and beach watching during rough weather was ordinary. Photographs taken that morning show people standing in ankle-to-knee water, some posing. These were not people ignoring warnings. They were people applying their entire accumulated experience to a situation their experience had not equipped them to read. The photographs are evidence of the cognitive gap between severe storm, which Galveston had survived many times, and city-ending surge event, which no living resident had experienced. The two look identical in their early stages. The differentiation only becomes visible when the water stops behaving like a storm and starts behaving like an ocean relocating itself. Others prepared as they would for any bad storm, securing shutters, moving valuables to upper floors, securing livestock. These were rational precautions for a bad storm. The precautions were calibrated to wind damage, not submersion. By early afternoon, the bridges to the mainland were under threat. Water was covering the approach roads. Streetcars had stopped. The 3 railroad trestles spanning Galveston Bay, the only routes off the island, sat in rising water. Those who recognized the window and had horses or wagons faced crossing through surge of unknown depth, with debris beginning to move in the current, wind climbing toward gale force, and no certainty the 2-mile-long trestles would still be passable by the time they reached the other side. Those without transportation faced the same crossing on foot. At approximately 3 p.m., the first bridge lost its Galveston side approach to surge. The second failed structurally around 4 p.m., piling scoured, track twisted. The third remained standing but impassable, blocked by wreckage and water too deep to ford. By late afternoon, the island had no exit. The window had not slammed shut. It had narrowed incrementally over 6 hours. And the people who did not leave had not made a single catastrophic decision. They had made a series of ordinary ones, each reasonable given what they knew at the time, each closing the window a little further until it was gone. Storm surge is not waves crashing over a barrier. It is the ocean's surface rising, a dome of displaced water pushed ahead of a hurricane's low-pressure center, elevated above normal sea level and moved horizontally across land. The displacement is caused by the low atmospheric pressure at the storm's core lifting the ocean's surface, combined with wind-driven water pushed inward toward shore. The two effects compound. Lower pressure creates a broader, slower dome. Onshore wind stacks additional water on top. The Galveston surge reached 15 to 20 feet above mean sea level. The island's highest point was 8.7 feet. The arithmetic is straightforward. The city did not flood. It submerged. By 3 p.m., water covered the entire island. Streets ceased to exist as navigable space. People retreated to second floors, then attics, then roofs. Wind reached an estimated 140 miles per hour, strong enough to strip roofing and collapse poorly braced walls, but wind was not the primary killing mechanism. The surge had already removed solid ground from beneath the city. Wind turned debris into projectiles moving through a current. Galveston's buildings were predominantly wood frame construction. As houses disintegrated under the combined pressure of surge and wind, they became components of a destruction system. Timbers torn from one structure became battering rams against the next. Walls collapsed into the current as multi-ton projectiles. Every building that fell added its mass to the flow that struck the next block. Survivors described the sound as continuous and mechanical. Freight trains, sustained artillery, the air vibrating at frequencies that disrupted thought. Families 10 feet apart could not hear each other shout. Human voices were simply not audible against it. The St. Mary's Orphanage stood in the southern section of the island, a 3-story building, housing 93 children and 10 sisters of the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. As water rose through the afternoon, the sisters moved the children to the 3rd floor. When the 3rd floor began taking water, they tied groups of children to themselves with clothesline, each sister binding 6 to 8 children to her body. If the building collapsed, the rope would keep the children from being swept away separately. The orphanage disintegrated at approximately 8 p.m. Rescuers found the bodies days later, still bound. The rope had held. The building had not. By evening, over 600 homes had been destroyed, not damaged, removed. Entire blocks were scoured to bare sand. Isaac Klein's house collapsed around 8:15 p.m. He was inside with his wife, 3 daughters, and his brother Joseph. When the building came apart, timber trapped his wife beneath the surface. Klein held his youngest daughter above water. Joseph pulled them both onto floating wreckage. Klein's wife drowned within arm's reach. Her body was never recovered. The meteorologist, who had published a paper guaranteeing Galveston's safety from hurricanes, spent the rest of the night floating on debris in the dark, calling his wife's name. Night fell around 8 p.m. There were no lights, no electricity, no fires. No moonlight through the storm clouds. Lightning provided brief illuminations, water where streets had been, debris fields extending to the horizon, bodies in the current. Then darkness again. Through the night, voices called from multiple directions, gradually growing quieter. Children called for parents. Adults shouted names until their voices failed. By midnight, the human sounds had mostly ceased. By dawn, even the wind had dropped. The water drained slowly back toward the Gulf, leaving behind what it had carried. The returning silence contained no city sounds, no bells, no horses, no voices. The storm had moved inland. What remained was the sound of debris settling and water trickling through broken structures into the flat expanse the surge had made. Surviving the night meant constant physical recalculation. William Herf, a documented survivor whose account appears in contemporary records, described moving from one piece of floating wreckage to the next as each piece sank beneath him. The debris field was dense, with massive timbers tumbling in the surge, sections of wall rotating in the current, furniture surfacing and submerging. Every platform eventually took on water, grew heavier, and settled lower. The calculation, whether to stay on a sinking piece or attempt to reach the next one in darkness, in current, with debris moving at unpredictable velocities, repeated every few minutes from late afternoon into the following morning. The wrong decision in either direction was fatal. Stay too long on a sinking beam and go under with it. The wrong moment and be struck by something moving faster than the current. Gulf water in September is warm, but sustained immersion, combined with the metabolic cost of continuous movement and the physiological effects of prolonged extreme fear, produced a hypothermic adjacent state that survivors described as cognitive dulling. Multiple accounts describe a dissociative quality, a detachment from immediate events that paradoxically may have helped. Panic burns energy. Calm preserves it. Several survivors noted feeling an unexpected stillness that kept them making decisions when terror might have stopped them. Parents described the most brutal arithmetic of the night, holding 2 children above water until one's own strength failed. The choice was binary: release one to save both or hold both and drown together. There was no third option. No good answer existed. Survivors who made either choice carried its consequences for the rest of their lives. The moral logic that organizes ordinary decisions, hierarchy of values, duty, love, had no applicable framework for this. Water did not negotiate with intention. Those who made it to dawn found survival was a matter of position, not virtue. People in 2-story brick structures at the northern end of the island had a better chance than people in single-story frame houses in the south, not because they were smarter or more prepared, but because they happened to be in a building that happened to be in a location where the surge depth happened to be survivable. The island's irregular topography, slight rises and depressions invisible to the eye before the storm, determined who lived in ways that bore no relationship to who had prepared, who had tried to leave, or who had tried to help others. Random elevation measured in inches was the variable that mattered most. September 9th arrived in eerie silence. No birds, no city sounds, no human activity. Survivors emerged into a landscape that had lost its reference points. Streets were unidentifiable. Buildings that served as landmarks were gone. People walked past neighbors without recognition, everyone coated in mud, injured, faces blank with shock. The air smelled of salt water, splintered wood, and decomposition already beginning in the September heat. The flat expanse of wreckage stretching to the horizon was the city. There was nothing else. Between 6,000 and 12,000 corpses lay across Galveston Island on the morning of September 9th. The count was never established with precision. Entire families had died with no one left to report them missing. The poorest residents, immigrant laborers, transient workers, the black community concentrated in the lowest lying sections, had never been systematically enumerated in life and could not be counted in death. Many bodies were too badly damaged for identification. Others were buried under wreckage that would take weeks to clear. In September Gulf Coast heat, decomposition began immediately. Authorities loaded bodies onto barges, weighted them, and dumped them beyond the offshore sandbars. Within 2 days, the corpses began washing back onto the beaches. Sea burial had failed. The decision was made to burn the dead where they lay. Funeral pyres burned continuously for weeks across the island, the smoke visible for miles. Work crews operated under martial law, conscripted at gunpoint to collect and burn thousands of bodies in advanced decay, given whiskey rations to manage the psychological cost. Those who refused were threatened with being shot. The emergency authority that replaced normal civic governance enforced its orders the only way available to it, with armed men and the removal of choice. Galveston did not abandon the site. Between 1902 and 1910, engineers jacked over 100 buildings onto temporary stilts, while dredges pumped sand beneath them, raising sections of the city by as much as 17 feet above their pre-storm grade. The process required cutting every utility connection to each building, gas lines, water pipes, sewer connections, then rerouting them at the new grade after the sand was in place. Buildings remained occupied during the process. Businesses operated from structures suspended in air, accessed by temporary stairs, adjusted weekly as the grade rose beneath them. Gravestones were lifted with the rest. The project covered over 500 city blocks and took 8 years. Simultaneously, construction began on a concrete seawall, 17 feet high, 16 feet thick at the base, initially 3.3 miles long, eventually extended to 10 miles. The wall was designed to break storm surge before it reached the elevated city. It worked. Galveston survived the 1915 hurricane with minor damage. Hurricane Ike in 2008, a Category 2 at landfall, produced surge reaching 15 to 20 feet in some areas and caused approximately $30 billion in damage. The seawall held. The western sections of the island, largely unwalled, flooded severely. Current modeling places Galveston within the highest risk zone for major hurricane damage on the Gulf Coast. The 1900 disaster is commemorated in museums and historical markers. The mass grave beneath the raised streets is invisible. Residents choose to live there for the beaches, the history, the affordability. Each generation interprets the lesson through their own experience, generally toward comfort rather than alarm. The seawall stands 17 feet above sea level, more than twice the island's natural maximum elevation. The storm that submerged the original city generated surge between 15 and 20 feet. The next major direct strike may not fit inside that margin. The city was raised. The Gulf was not. On the morning of September 9th, 1900, a man stood in what should have been his street, turning in slow circles, unable to orient himself. Every landmark was gone. The houses, the trees, the street itself. Where the fourth largest city in Texas had stood, there was a flat expanse of wreckage and bodies. He could not find his address because it no longer had a surface. The storm that produced this had been forecast 5 days before landfall by meteorologists in Cuba, whose warnings were not relayed. It had been measurable on the morning of September 8th in the barometric data Isaac Klein recorded, and the tide gauges and the double swells arriving on the beach. The warning system existed. It failed at every link. The institutional dismissal of better data, the decade of false assurance embedded in a scientific paper. The physical reality that storm surge rises faster than a barrier island can be evacuated. Seawall Galveston built afterward acknowledges all of this. The city built it and then rebuilt on the same spot, because people do not leave places that made them wealthy just because the water came once. The seawall is 17 feet tall. The 1900 surge reached 15 to 20 feet. The margin is narrower than the monument suggests.